I'm going to make you feel very uncomfortable today. And I'm going to do this by challenging the new notions of social justice that have emerged in education over the past decade. Right from the get-go, I want you to understand my contention. Students with disabilities should not be in mainstream schools. Does that idea make you feel uncomfortable? Good. Research tells us that this discomfort is where learning happens. So if you feel challenged by the idea that people with disabilities don't belong in mainstream schools, you're ready to learn why. I know this based on a theoretical framework called a pedagogy of discomfort. It's something that we as educators need to embrace. For those of you who don't know, pedagogy is what educators do. Pedagogy is the art and the act of engaging learners in opening up new possibilities and ideas. I'm quite confident that you're all familiar with the notion of discomfort, but what about the practice of discomfort? It's time that we move outside of our comfort zones and sit with our discomforting emotions. Our discomforting emotions are where we are able to challenge the dominant beliefs, social habits, and normative practices that sustain social inequalities. I suspect some of you are probably clinging to this discussion of pedagogy like a lifeboat. Oh, thank goodness she stopped talking about excluding people with disabilities from mainstream schools. No, we're still going to go there. We are still going to go there in all of our discomfort to unpack the difference between equity and equality. I stand before you today to argue that placing students with disabilities in mainstream schools is, in many cases, disadvantaging them. Sadly, students with visible disabilities used to be routinely excluded from all types of education. This was a reflection of their exclusion from broader society at the time. As Western societies shifted its perceptions of disability to encompass a more socially just view of people with disabilities, schools that catered to specific needs of disabled students were. This is where things get a little tricky. These special schools are typically viewed one of two ways. People tend to either think, great, here is a place where these kids can get an education tailored to their specific needs from people who are trained to help them. Or there's the other side where you think, terrible idea. Students who happen to have a disability deserve to interact in society in the same way as their peers, and their presence in school serves as a lesson on inclusion and diversity for everyone involved. Are you feeling uncomfortable? Good. Sit with that discomfort for a moment. I propose that it is this exact feeling of discomfort that has led to students with disabilities being taken out of special schools and placed into mainstream schools. When we as a society shifted our views of disability away from a medical rhetoric and towards a social model, disability education was framed as a civil rights movement. This has its benefits, like providing more opportunities for people with disability to engage in communities. However, the issue has become politicized in a way that neglects the reality of what it takes to work in an environment that caters for the needs of disabled people. As a society, we began to feel deeply uncomfortable, not so much at the presence of special schools, but at the absence of people with disabilities in mainstream schools. It was that discomfort that led to the assumption that something needed to change. The reason for this is because as a society, we began to value inclusion as the highest form of social justice, and exclusion, way at the other end of the spectrum, as the lowest form of social behaviour. So when people with disabilities began to be seen not as disabled people, but as multifaceted individuals who happen to have a disability, there was a shift in the social paradigm in politics. And that shift extended to education, where a social model of disability was adopted. Those in favour of a social model argue that it allows educators to retract our gaze from impairments or limitations, suggesting that the education of students with disabilities is some kind of a binary in which educators either ignore the diversity of their students and look to blame systematic failures for the difficulty in educating them, or acknowledge the scope of challenges presented in educating students with disabilities and fail to include them. Realistically, neither of these are the case. Students with disabilities often present a range of medical, social, educational, and political concerns within a school context, and ignoring the existence of these factors is not helpful. Suggesting that educators retract our gaze from impairments is recommending a willful ignorance that serves nobody. We cannot take a holistic and student-centered approach by ignoring the fundamental aspects of that person's being And this is the part that makes people uncomfortable. Disability is a fundamental aspect of many people's existences. So much so that it is now written into Australian law, the Disability Standards for Education, that mainstream schools must accommodate people with disabilities within the mainstream classroom. This can present a range of complexities, the nuances of which cannot be covered entirely in one TED Talk. That is largely due to the enormous umbrella of disability, which has innumerable variations. However, in the rush to elevate inclusion as the best possible outcome for everyone, too many of the problems associated with placing certain students with disabilities into mainstream education have been overlooked. For example, students who work in special schools are trained in and approved to use restraint. Teachers in mainstream schools are not trained and thus not equipped to do so, yet are legally obligated to accept these same students who may need these kinds of interventions. As you can imagine, this can lead to an array of problems for all involved, from low-level disruption and disengaged behaviours in the classroom, which is the number one behavioural issue faced by teachers, all the way to physically endangering students and teachers, resulting in the loss of a safe and supportive learning environment, a standard which teachers must provide to all of their students. Deeply entrenched social norms create and sustain the structures that privilege or oppress, norms which are attained by significant emotional response. We are so focused on inclusion looking like assimilation that we are neglecting the fact that students with disabilities really do have special needs, needs that cannot always be wholly accommodated in mainstream classrooms, at least not as they stand right now. There are researchers furiously fighting this notion who suggest that special needs students do not need more teacher time, extra resources, or special expertise, calling these issues myths. Not only does this undermine the valuable work of those who are qualified to work in the disability sector, but it perpetuates the lack of support, funding, resources, and recognition that teachers need to support students who have disabilities. We know that teachers who are at the helm of this issue are favourably disposed to the inclusion of students with mild disabilities, but view the inclusion of students with more than a mild disability as unrealistic. This suggests that teachers are acutely aware of the increased needs associated with catering for students who have moderate to severe disabilities. Right now, in Australian classrooms, teachers do not feel equipped to meet those needs. My one idea, and it's going to take people much smarter than me to make this happen, is the creation of really special schools. That is schools that are integrated for students both with and without disabilities, but which have the proper training, resources, and facilities to manage the realities of what this actually looks like. I'm talking about schools where every single teacher is trained in education as well as holding qualifications in disability. At the moment, teacher education courses focus only on the inclusion of people with disabilities, but offer no practical training or realistic idea of what this might actually involve. In Australia, to work in the community with people who have disabilities, carers are required to have a minimum of a Certificate 4 in disability, with many organisations insisting on a diploma level qualification. But in mainstream schools, teachers are not required to have any such qualifications, but they are required under law to differentiate their teaching practices to accommodate their students' learning needs, including the people with disabilities. As you can imagine, this can lead to widespread educational disadvantages, all in the name of inclusion. There is a similar problem with special schools. Educators in these schools are disability specialists, but tend to have lower levels of qualification and experience in the field of education. Do we need brand new purpose-built schools? No. The solution is actually much simpler than that. We need to send teachers back to school. One small thing we can do to bring this idea to life is to embed the existing Certificate 4 in Disability Studies into all new teacher education courses. That way, the next generation of teacher and all future generations of teachers will have the skills that they need to differentiate their learning programs in a way that ensures true equity. Of course, skills are useless without supports, which is why I want to take this idea one step further and suggest that anyone in a management position, that is a position of power, should also go and do this qualification. This will help them to really understand the needs of those students and the needs of the teachers who are expected to support them. Of course, like all good ideas, it would require a financial investment. But the new reality of education, with the engagement of young people with disabilities on the rise, is really special schools. Schools that are thoughtfully designed to accommodate everyone, with the single most important influence on student outcomes that we can vary, that's teachers by the way, at the top of the list of priorities. I want you to get uncomfortable with the current choices in education for students with disabilities, because despite what you've been conditioned to accept, it's actually not equitable. Research tells us that it is time now to problematize the way we emotionally react to inequitable habits and routines. When we hear that mainstream schools are not suitable for kids with disabilities, we need to problematize our emotional reaction to hearing that. Get so uncomfortable with this idea that you can petition for change so that over time, Australia can have some really special schools.